Well, if you were to walk into my office, if you were to go through those doors and walk down the hallway and into my office, the very first thing that you would see as you enter into my office is a movie poster that hangs on the wall. And that movie is Chariots of Fire. That is one of my favorite movies of all time because, as many of you know, I've been a competitive runner since I was in middle school. You know, this is not the body of an offensive lineman, all right? This is a distance runner. But I had a tradition when I was a teenager, as a routine, that every night before a race, I would always watch an inspirational sports movie to kind of get me in the zone, to motivate me, pump me up. And the movie that I kept coming back to over and over and over again, the one I would watch before all the most important races, was Chariots of Fire. And Chariots of Fire tells the true story of a man named Eric Liddell, who was the Olympic champion in the 400-meter dash at the 1924 Paris Olympics. And so as a teenager who all I wanted to do was win championship races, it's all I thought about. So Eric Liddell was a hero to me. And he was a hero to me because of his athletic accomplishments. But as I've gotten older, I care a little bit less about winning championships. Those days have passed me by. But now what I care about, the thing I think about, is I want to be known as a man of consequence. I want to be known as a man of conviction. I want to be known as a man of faith and a man of courage. I want to be a good man. I want to be a godly man. And for this reason, this is why I still love Chariots of Fire and why I still look to Eric Liddell as a hero in my adult life, not because of his athletic achievements, but because of his character and his example of what a godly man ought to look like. And for the last several weeks, we've been in a teaching series called The Cloud, where we've been looking at biographies of great Christians who've gone before us. And it's based on that passage in Hebrews 12 that says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses," meaning those who have gone before us, faithful Christians who are in heaven. It says, "Therefore, since we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith." And what the author of Hebrews says here is that by remembering the lives of faithful Christians who have gone before us, we can be strengthened in our faith today. And so today, I want us to look at the life of Eric Liddell. In 2016, a best-selling biography of Liddell was published, and I love the title. It was titled, "For the Glory." And you read that, and on the surface you would think, well, this is a man who ran for the glory that comes when you win gold medals. But if you know the life of Eric Liddell, and you will today, you know that he did not live his life, nor did he run races for personal glory or for gold medals or worldwide fame, but he lived a life that was fully and totally for the glory of God in his generation. And I don't know about you, but that's what I want for my life. And that's what I hope you want for your life. And so the question for us this morning is, what does a life lived for the glory of God look like? If you're anything like me, you don't want this life to pass you by. If you're anything like me, you don't want to waste the one and only life God has given you. You want it to be used for the glory of God and the good of others. And so what does that look like? And today we look to the life of Eric Liddell. And I'll just say this, particularly for men, in an age where there are so few masculine examples of what it means to be godly, Eric Liddell is an example for us. And so will you look with me at 2 Timothy chapter 4? Our scripture today is 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 6 through 8. And the Apostle Paul writes this. The Apostle Paul says, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord the righteous will judge. The Lord the righteous judge will award me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing." Now, the Apostle Paul writes this passage near the very end of his life. 2 Timothy is a letter that he wrote to a young man named Timothy, for whom Paul was his mentor. Timothy was like a son to Paul, and he writes this letter to him as sort of his final instructions on how Timothy can live a life of consequence and conviction for the glory of God. And Paul is saying to Timothy, he's saying, follow my example. And what was Paul's example? Well, he was a man whose life was marked by generosity. He used the gifts and the opportunities that God gave him for the glory of God and not merely his own personal gain. He was a man of conviction and courage. He stood for his convictions even in the face of insults and persecution. And he was a man of faith. He was totally surrendered to God and to the will of God. And when I look at the life of Eric Liddell, I see a life lived with similar characteristics. And so let's just do like a brief biography of Eric Liddell, and then we'll kind of work through the passage. So who is Eric Liddell? Eric Liddell was born in China in 1902. He was the son of Scottish missionaries. And when he was 6 years old, his parents stayed on the mission field but sent him and his brother to boarding school in Scotland. And while he was in school, it quickly became evident that he was an exceptional athlete. He excelled in both track and rugby. In fact, as a college student, he made the Scottish national rugby team and became a bit of a national celebrity for his fast pace of play and his kind of chaotic form of play. He was kind of a wild card out there on the field. But track is the sport where he shined most brightly. As a young man, he broke the British record in the 100 meters. He was also the British champion in the 200 meters. But in 1924, Eric Liddell was selected to the British Olympic team, where he was invited to compete in the 100-meter dash as well as the 4x100-meter relay. And he was favored to win the gold medal in these events. He was the fastest man in the world. He was going to win the 100-meter dash. However, when the schedule of the Olympics was released, Eric Liddell noticed that the preliminary rounds of the 100-meter dash were scheduled to be run on a Sunday. Now, as a Christian, Eric Liddell had a deep conviction that racing on Sunday would be a violation of the fourth commandment to honor the Sabbath, where God commanded his people to have a day of rest and worship and not work and strive. And this was Liddell's deep-seated conviction, and he simply could not violate his conscience. So he withdrew from the 100-meter dash, his best event, and the one where he was predicted to win the gold medal, and he decided to run a different event. And when he did this, he faced relentless scrutiny and mockery from the press. He faced pressure from his teammates because he also withdrew from the 4x100-meter relay. And they were going, "Are you kidding me?" His patriotism was called into question. But he was a man who simply could not violate his spiritual convictions. And so he requested to run the 400-meter dash instead, a race that he was not considered world-class in. And if you're familiar with track and field, the 100-meter dash and the 400-meter dash are two very different events. It takes very different body types and skills to run those events. But he said, you know what, I'm not going to run the 100 on a Sunday, but I'll do this event that's kind of outside my wheelhouse. And people were confused. They were enraged. Why would their nation's best runner withdraw from his best event to run a race that he had no chance of doing anything in? It was the question that people were asking. But Liddell adapted his training in the weeks leading up to the Olympics. And long story short, Eric Liddell shocked the world when he won the 400 meters in world record time. All right? And that you think that's the story, right? But that's just the beginning. After the Olympics, Eric Liddell was one of the most famous men in Scotland. He was known as the Flying Scotsman. And he could have enjoyed a long life of celebrity in his homeland. He could have turned that probably into business opportunities. But what he chose to do instead shocked the world. He felt that God was calling him to become a missionary to China. And that's exactly what he did. He laid down the fame, he laid down all the accolades, he laid down the worldwide recognition, and he moved to China into obscurity, where he taught science to Chinese college students, while he also ministered to them and shared the gospel with them. Now I want you to imagine for a moment a man who is a celebrity in his own nation, giving it all up, moving into obscurity to teach in a small classroom in China. This was a man of conviction. And while he was in China, he married and had a family. But by 1941, World War II was in full swing, and China became a very dangerous place to be. So he sent his family to Canada, where they would be safe, while he stayed behind to continue ministering in China. And in 1943, after Japan had attacked the United States and China, Liddell was arrested and placed in an internment camp where he was beaten and suffered relentlessly. And while he was in the internment camp, he took it upon himself to be the chaplain to all the other prisoners. He organized events to help them in their boredom. He organized worship services to keep their eyes fixed on Jesus during the harsh time of being prisoners. And he was constantly thinking of others, even when he was a prisoner himself. And in 1945, he began to experience terrible headaches. and discovered after his death that he had had a brain tumor growing the whole time. But on February 21st, 1945, he suffered a stroke, and that night he went to be with Jesus, and his biographer says that his final words were, "It is all surrender." That's the life of Eric Liddell. Now, looking at 2 Timothy 4, the life of Paul and the life of Eric Liddell, let's consider today what are the characteristics of a life that glorifies God. The first characteristic of a life that glorifies God is generosity. Paul says to Timothy in verse 6, he says, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering." Now, Paul is using sacrificial language here. To pour something out as a drink offering. This is, as an act of worship, people would bring their drink offerings of expensive wine, and they would pour it out at the altar as a way of saying to God, "God, everything that I have is yours. Everything you have given me, I freely offer to you. Pour out my life for your glory." This is what people would do as an act of worship. And Paul is saying to Timothy that my whole life has been about this. My whole life has been a drink offering that has been poured out for the glory of God and the good of others. The gifts that God has given me, the opportunities God has given me, the relationships God has given me, the life that God has given me, the education God has given me. Paul says, I have used them all for His glory and the good of others. And Paul is saying to Timothy, do likewise. Don't use your gifts, don't use your possessions, your opportunities merely for selfish gain, but for the glory of God and the good of others. Give those things freely for God. And Eric Liddell, he was known as a very generous man. He was generous with his encouragement and kindness. He was well beloved by his peers and his competitors. In fact, and I love this, his biographer says, between the starter's pistol and the finisher's tape was the only time that Eric did not intentionally put others ahead of himself. I think that's a great quote, right? When he was in the internment camp, he put others ahead of himself. He was the one organizing worship services and games for other prisoners, despite facing his own suffering and dealing with headaches from a growing brain tumor. Even as he was suffering, he was pouring himself out for others. That's what a godly man looks like. And more importantly, a turning point in Eric's life came when he was a young man. He had this growing relationship with God. His faith was important to him. But he was kind of restless and he was a little bit insecure because he wanted to serve God with his life, but he didn't know how. And he didn't really know how to use his gifts. In fact, he didn't even think he had any gifts. He was like, in his mind, he was like, I'm just a jock. What do I have to give? And in his eyes, he didn't have much to offer. He didn't see himself as a public speaker. He didn't see himself as a Bible teacher. And he was like, I don't have the skills that people who are traditionally known for their faith have. But he still wanted to serve Jesus. And so one night he prayed. He said, Lord, this was just the prayer he prayed. He said, Lord, I want to serve you. I'll just leave it at that. Whatever you ask, I'll do. What a simple prayer. Lord, I just want to serve you. I'll leave it at that. Whatever you ask, I will do. And this is what I mean by generosity. Eric Liddell says, here is all of my life, Lord. I give all of it to you. Wherever you lead, I'll go. Whatever you ask, I'll give. And Eric Liddell did that. A year later, after praying this prayer, he would give up his dreams of 100-meter glory and run the 400 instead. He would give up the celebrity later and the opportunities of national fame to become a missionary. He would later give up his comforts and by sending his family to safety while he stayed in China to minister to hurting people. And ultimately, he would lay down his life. Whatever you ask, I'll do, was the prayer of Eric Liddell, and he answered that prayer. And his final words, his biographer says, it is surrender. Surrender is an act of generosity. When we baptize here at Calvary, in this baptistry over here, we always ask two questions. The first is, do you believe that Jesus Christ has done everything necessary to save you? That's somebody saying, I profess that Jesus has died for my sins and risen for my victory. I believe that He has done everything necessary to make me right with God. And then the second question we ask is, are you willing to go wherever He calls you to go and do whatever He asks you to do? Now, that can be something as big as going on the mission field, like Eric Liddell. Or it can be something as simple as tithing or serving in kids ministry. Or it could be walking across the street and talking to your neighbor. But that is a life lived to the glory of God. Generosity. Lord, here it is. Do with it as you wish. See, a life lived for the glory of God is marked by generosity. Here I am, Lord. Do whatever you ask. I'll do whatever you ask. So generosity is the first mark of a life lived for the glory of God. The second is conviction. Paul says in verse 7, he says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. Now, don't raise your hand, but how many of you have ever been in a fight, right? Or if you've ever run in a race. Those things are not pleasant. Either one of those things, right? Getting in a fist fight, running a race, those things are by definition painful. There's pain involved. And what any fight requires, what any race requires is passion. You got to have a sense of passion to be in a fight or to run a race. Because I know this, I've run many races in my life. During any race, there is a temptation to back off the pace. There's a temptation to quit. There's a temptation to walk. There's a temptation to kind of back off. But the ones who finish strong and the ones who run their races well are the ones who run not for the pleasure of the temporary moment, but they run with conviction for the joy of the finish line. So the finish line is what's in view, not the comfort in the present moment. And you know, my counselor, he says that all of us were created with a deep sense of passion for something. Our job in life is to discover what we're passionate about. And what is passion? My counselor says that passion is the willingness to be in pain for something that matters more than the pain. Passion is the willingness to be in pain for something that matters more than the pain itself. And it takes conviction and it takes courage to be passionate about anything. Paul was a man of conviction and courage. He stood before hostile crowds and proclaimed Jesus as the Son of God. He was stoned, he was beaten, he was jailed, he was insulted, yet he never wavered in his commitment to proclaiming Jesus as the Son of God. His passion was for God's glory. And he demonstrated that passion by conviction and courage, even in the face of persecution. Eric Liddell also was a man of conviction and courage. His conviction was that all of his life was God's, to be used however God asked. That included his running. And that meant that he didn't run on Sundays. That's how he understood and interpreted God's commandment to honor the Sabbath. Now, for what it's worth, you might see me running on Sundays, and you're like, hey, is Will less spiritual than Eric Liddell? What's going on here? For what it's worth, I don't have the same conviction as Eric Liddell. I interpret that command differently, all right? I actually use Eric Liddell's words in the movie Chariots of Fire to justify my interpretation. He says, God made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. And I love that quote because I feel it too. It's something God's gifted me with. When I run, I feel the pleasure of God. So I run to experience nearness with God, not to run from him. And Jesus himself said, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So I interpret that as if something brings me joy and connects me to God, I can do it on the Sabbath, okay? So that's my conviction. Listen, I don't say that to denigrate Eric Liddell's conviction. What I'm saying is I respect any man who has a conviction and stands by it, even if I may disagree with his conviction. And Liddell had a strong conviction, and he endured public shame and humiliation for his decision not to run that race. But listen, his eyes weren't on what the press was saying. His eyes weren't on what his teammates were saying. His eyes were set on honoring Jesus. And so that's what motivated him. And moments before Eric Liddell was called to the starting line to run his Olympic 400-meter race, one of the British trainers and a fellow Christian handed Eric Liddell a note. And on the note were the words from 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 30, that said, "Those who honor me, I will honor." Eric Liddell honored God, and in return, God honored him. Eric Liddell was a man of conviction and courage. He was willing to be in pain for something that mattered more than the pain. And let me just ask you straight up, what are you passionate about? What are you willing to be in pain for? What are you willing to be in pain for? What are you willing to endure pain for? What are you passionate about? If we want our lives to be lived for the glory of God, we must be passionate about his glory. And we must have conviction and courage. So we need generosity, conviction. Those are marks of a life lived for the glory of God. And finally, number 3, faith. Paul says, he ends his letter or this passage like this. He says, I have kept the faith. Henceforth, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. Now, Paul talks about receiving the crown of righteousness. Now, that's what we all want. That's what we're all living for. That's what we're all striving for. To be considered righteous, to be right, to be worthy, to be acceptable, to be loved. We're all seeking to prove ourselves worthy. But the gospel of Jesus says that through faith in Jesus, God has given us a new identity. We are no longer orphans trying to prove our worth, but we are beloved children of God who can rest in the arms of a loving Father. A child who knows they're loved by their father doesn't have to prove themselves to their father. They just go and they sit in his presence. And this is the good news of Christianity, is that we no longer have to strive and labor to gain an identity because we've already been given one through faith in Jesus. But the truth is, we all have a hard time. We may know that in truth, but we have a hard time accepting this as reality. And so we walk around carrying our insecurities. We walk around feeling unworthy, this sense of unworthiness, and we're looking to prove ourselves. We do this with our work. We do this with parenting. We do this with our achievements. We do it with all sorts of things, with our education. And in the movie Chariots of Fire, Eric Liddell, he's set in contrast with another one of his teammates, a British Olympian named Harold Abrahams. And Eric, of course, he's very secure in his identity in Jesus, right? God made me fast, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. That's why he ran, to experience the goodness and nearness of God. He runs out of a sense of joy and worship. He's not trying to prove himself through his accolades on the track. Harold Abrahams, on the other hand, he wasn't running to please God. He was running to prove that he was worthy of love and acceptance. In one of the saddest lines of the movie, Abrahams is reflecting on his upcoming race. He's sitting in the room waiting to be called to run, and he says these words. He says, "And now, in 1 hour's time, I'll be out there on the track again. I will raise my eyes and look down that corridor, that track lane, 4 feet wide, and I'll have 10 lonely seconds to justify my existence." Did you hear what he said? He said, I have a 10-second race to prove my worth, to justify my existence. Harold Abrahams was a slave. He was a slave to his performance. And let me ask, what about our lives? Because we can live in one of two ways. The scriptures use a race as a metaphor for our lives. All of us are running a race. And we can all run that race in one of two ways. One, we can run it as a way to glorify God. We can live our lives to glorify God. Or we can run our race, we can live our lives, we can go about our work, we can go about our parenting, our education, and all of these things as an attempt to justify our existence. To say to others, look at what I've done, have I done enough? Do you accept me yet? Am I lovable? Am I acceptable? And if you choose option 2, here's the thing, you will never be at rest. You'll never be at rest. You'll always wonder, have I done enough? Am I significant enough? Do I matter now? And if you are living your life merely to prove yourself, to justify yourself, if your faith is in your performance, you'll never be able to be truly generous. You'll never be able to truly have conviction or courage, because your money, your gifts, your comfort, your time, all of those things are part of your justification, and you need those things. You need to control those things. But if you believe that Jesus has done everything necessary to save you, if you believe that through his death and resurrection you've been made a beloved child of God, and your future is secure, and your worth is settled, then you can live a life for the glory of God and not for earthly things, because those things are secondary. They're trivial in comparison to the glory of God. You can live a life of generosity because your eyes are not set on your finances or your time or your energy, but your eyes are set on Jesus. And you know that Jesus has been extravagantly generous to you. He gave his place in heaven. He came to you. He gave all of his life so that you could find yours. Jesus was generous. Therefore, we can be generous by looking to his example. You can live a life of courage and conviction. You can endure pain because you're passionate for things that matter more than pain. And you look to Jesus. It says, Jesus, who endured the cross, despising its shame for the joy set before him. See, Jesus was able to endure the pain of the cross because he was passionate for your salvation. And that mattered more to him than the pain of the temporary, of the moment. He was willing to endure pain for something that mattered more than the pain. This is the gospel of Jesus. And when we look to him as our example, we can live similarly. See, the secret sauce of Eric Liddell's life was faith. He had faith that God already accepted him. He didn't need to win races to please the press or to feel worthy. He had faith that God would provide. He didn't need to seek comfort or safety. He could minister in China. And because of his faith, he lived for the glory of God and not himself. And my prayer is that we would all do the same. Paul says, I have kept the faith. Henceforth, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. Now, that crown of righteousness is not an Olympic gold medal. It's not the approval of your peers. It's the joy of knowing Jesus. So men and women of Calvary, let me encourage you. Let us run like Eric Liddell ran. Let us run like the Apostle Paul ran. Let us fix our eyes, as Hebrews 12 says, on the founder and perfecter of our faith and run with endurance the race marked out for us. This is what I want our lives to be marked by: generosity, conviction, and faith. It's an honor to be your pastor. Let me pray for you. Lord, we thank you for the lives of those who've gone before us, the examples of faithful Christians who have demonstrated what it looks like to live out the truth and the comfort of the Scriptures. I thank you for men and women who have run their race with endurance, keeping the faith and pointing to Jesus. God, we thank you for the example of Eric Liddell, a man who gave you his strength, his talent, his platform, and ultimately his life for your glory. Help us to follow his example, and even more, help us to follow the example of your Son, Jesus. Teach us to live generously. Make us people of courage and conviction. Help us fight the good fight. Help us finish our race. Help us keep the faith so that at the end we might too hear you say, well done, good and faithful servant. So we surrender to you, Lord, and we ask you to be glorified in our lives. And it's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.